The rebirth of duty. What do you owe other people? There are certain questions we ask ourselves so often that we stop realizing they're philosophical questions. Should I tell the truth? Should I keep my promise? Should I help this person? Should I protect myself first? Should I forgive someone who hurt me? Should I give someone a second chance? Should I follow the rules when the rules don't seem fair? Should I sacrifice my own interests for someone else? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what do I actually owe other people? We usually don't think about morality this way. We think morality is something obvious. Don't steal, don't lie, don't hurt people, keep your promises, be fair, help others, respect people's freedom. But the moment life becomes complicated, these simple principles begin to collide. You can be honest and hurt someone. You can keep a promise and do something wrong. You can protect your freedom while making someone else's life harder. You can be loyal to a friend while knowing your friend is wrong. You can follow the law and still feel that you have done something morally wrong. And sometimes doing what seems morally right requires you to sacrifice something you desperately want. Your comfort, your money, your reputation, your time, your relationship, your future. This is where morality stops being a collection of nice ideas. It becomes personal. Because philosophy is not really interesting when it tells you something you already believe. Philosophy becomes interesting when it forces you to question why you believe it. Why do you think something is right? Because there is a rule? Because someone has the right to it? Because it produces a better outcome? Because it makes you a better person? Because you care about the people involved? Or perhaps because everyone around you has taught you to think that way? These questions have occupied philosophers for thousands of years. And today, we're going to explore 4 of the most influential approaches to morality: duty, rights, virtue, and care. But instead of treating them as 4 theories sitting inside a philosophy textbook, we're going to ask a much more practical question. What does each of these theories reveal about the way you actually live? Because you're making moral decisions every day, you just don't always call them moral decisions. The world of duty. Let's begin with duty. The philosophical tradition known as deontology comes from the Greek word deon, meaning duty or obligation. At its heart is an idea that sounds simple. Some things are right because they are our duty to do them, and some things are wrong because we have a duty not to do them. The philosopher most strongly associated with this approach is Immanuel Kant. And Kant's project was ambitious. He wanted morality to have a foundation that didn't depend on personal preference. Because think about what happens if morality is nothing more than personal preference. You say, I think lying is wrong. Someone else says, I don't. You say, stealing is wrong. They say, not if I need something badly enough. You say, treating people unfairly is wrong. They answer, only if society says it is. If morality is completely dependent on individual preference, then it becomes difficult to explain why anyone should be morally obligated to do anything. Kant wanted something stronger. He believed morality had to be grounded in reason. And this led him toward one of his most famous ideas, the categorical imperative. The basic principle asks us to consider whether the rule behind our action could be consistently applied to everyone. In simpler language, before you act, ask yourself, what if everyone behaved according to the same principle I am using right now? That question is more powerful than it initially sounds. Think about lying. Suppose you decide that lying is acceptable whenever it benefits you. At first, that seems useful. You can lie when you want money, lie when you want to avoid responsibility, lie when you want to protect your reputation, lie when telling the truth would be inconvenient. But now take the principle seriously. What happens if everyone treats promises and statements as tools to manipulate others whenever convenient? Trust begins to collapse, promises to lose their meaning. People stop believing in each other. The social practice you are depending on becomes weaker because you are making an exception for yourself. Kant's point is not simply that lying can cause bad consequences. His deeper point is that your moral principle has to be one you can rationally universalize, and there is something powerful about that idea. Because human beings are extremely good at making exceptions for themselves. We judge our own behavior according to one standard and everyone else's behavior according to another. When someone else lies to us, we call them dishonest. When we lie, we call it protecting someone's feelings. When someone else breaks a promise, we call them unreliable. When we break one, we explain the circumstances. When someone else takes advantage of a situation, we call them selfish. When we do it, we say, "I had no choice." Duty challenges that tendency. It says, your moral standards cannot simply change depending on whose behavior you're judging. And that is one reason the idea of duty remains so powerful. Why duty matters. Think about the people you trust. Why do you trust them? Probably not because they always produce the best possible outcome. You trust them because you believe certain things about their character and behavior. You believe they will keep their word. You believe they won't betray you when it becomes inconvenient. You believe they won't suddenly change their principles because they can benefit from doing so. In other words, you trust them because you believe they have limits. There are things they simply will not do. That's what moral rules can provide. A person without principles can become unpredictable. If someone tells you, "I'll do whatever benefits me," you immediately understand that you cannot rely on them. But someone who says, "There are certain things I will never do, even if doing them benefits me," is giving you something extremely valuable. Predictability, trust, moral stability. This is one of the great strengths of deontological thinking. It protects the idea that there should be boundaries around human behavior. There are things we shouldn't do simply because we can. There are things we shouldn't do simply because doing them would benefit us. And there are things we should do even when nobody is watching. That last part is especially important. Because if you only behave morally when there is a reward, are you really acting morally? If you tell the truth only because you are afraid of getting caught, what happens when you know you can lie safely? If you keep your promise only because someone is monitoring you, what happens when nobody is? Duty says morality should survive the absence of surveillance. You should do the right thing because it is right, not because someone is watching. But what happens when duties collide? And here the beautiful simplicity of duty begins to encounter the complexity of real life. Because what happens when you have two duties? Suppose you believe honesty is a duty. You also believe protecting innocent people is a duty. Now imagine those two principles point in different directions. Which one wins? This is one of the criticisms directed towards strict forms of deontology. The theory can give us powerful principles, but life sometimes creates situations in which principles conflict. You may have a responsibility to your employer and a responsibility to expose wrongdoing. You may have a responsibility to your family and a responsibility to treat everyone fairly. You may have a responsibility to keep promises and a responsibility to prevent harm. You may have a responsibility to respect someone's freedom and a responsibility to protect another person from the consequences of that freedom. This is where the moral world becomes uncomfortable, because sometimes there isn't a perfect answer. There are only competing responsibilities. The source material raises this concern directly. Strict duty-based ethics, can struggle to explain how we should rank conflicting duties when genuine moral dilemmas arise. And this matters beyond philosophy. You experience smaller versions of this conflict all the time. Your friend asks you to keep a secret, but the secret could hurt someone. Your boss asks you to follow a policy, but the policy seems unfair. Someone you love asks you for help, but helping them could damage your own future. A family member expects your loyalty, but you know they're wrong. So the question isn't simple, what is my duty? Sometimes the question becomes, which duty should take priority? And that's much harder. The problem of the isolated individual. There's another criticism worth considering. A strict focus on autonomy and individual moral agency can make human beings appear more independent than they really are. But you didn't create yourself. Nobody does. You were shaped by parents, teachers, friends, communities, culture, economic circumstances, opportunities, trauma, love, failure, luck. The people around you have influenced the person you became, and you influence them in return. This means morality doesn't happen between isolated individuals floating in space. It happens inside relationships. You are someone's child. You might be someone's parent. You are someone's friend, someone's coworker, someone's neighbor, someone's partner, someone who will eventually need help, and someone who may eventually be asked to provide it. This creates a problem for any morality that focuses too heavily on autonomous individuals. Because sometimes the morally important fact isn't simple. What right does this individual have? It's what relationship exists between these people? And that question will become central later when we reach care ethics. But first, we need to move from duty to another word that dominates modern political and moral life. Rights. The age of rights. If you live in a modern democratic society, you hear the language of rights constantly. You have a right to speak, a right to privacy, a right to own property, a right to vote, a right to practice your beliefs, a right to equal treatment, a right to pursue happiness. The language of rights has become so familiar that we rarely stop asking what a right actually is. And that is where philosophy becomes interesting again. Because saying, I have a right to this, is not the end of an argument. It is the beginning of one. Where did that come from? Who has to respect it? Can it be taken away? Does it exist naturally? Does society create it? And if two rights conflict, which one wins? Natural rights. John Locke was enormously influential in the development of natural rights thinking. The basic idea is that certain rights exist independently of government. Government does not create them. Government is supposed to protect them. This distinction is incredibly important. Because if rights come entirely from government, then a government could theoretically say, you no longer have this right. But if some rights belong to you simply because you are human, government doesn't have unlimited authority over you. This idea became deeply influential in modern political thought. The language of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness became part of the American political tradition. And the attraction is obvious. Rights can act as a barrier between the individual and power. They say, there are things you are not allowed to do to me simply because you have more power. That is an extraordinary moral idea. History gives us countless examples of why such protection matters. But rights create another philosophical problem. Because once we say something is a right, we need to explain what that right requires from everyone else. The difference between liberty and welfare, one useful distinction is between liberty rights and welfare rights. A liberty right generally involves being free from interference. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, privacy, property. The basic idea is, Let me live my life without unjustified interference. Welfare rights are different. They involve access to goods or services considered necessary for people to pursue meaningful lives. Education, healthcare, public safety, other forms of social support. And this creates a fascinating disagreement. Suppose you say, healthcare is a human right. That statement sounds straightforward. But now ask, who has the responsibility to provide it? Doctors, hospitals, taxpayers, government, private companies, society as a whole. A right that requires resources create obligations. And that is why rights don't exist in isolation. Every claim about a right eventually raises another question. Who owes what to whom? The letter to Santa problem. The source material uses a provocative criticism associated with Jeane Kirkpatrick. The idea that if every desirable social good is simply declared a right, rights can become like writing letters to Santa. The phrase is provocative because it points toward a genuine philosophical problem. If everything we want becomes a right, how do we distinguish a genuine moral entitlement from a desire? I want a comfortable life. Does that make comfort a right? I want a good education. Is education a right? I want health care. Is health care a right? I want a safe neighborhood. Is safety a right? I want financial security. Is financial security a right? The problem isn't that these things are unimportant. The problem is that calling something a right doesn't automatically tell us why it is a right, and that is the challenge rights-based ethics has to answer. When rights collide, rights can also collide. Your freedom can conflict with another person's security. Your property rights can conflict with society's desire for redistribution. One person's claim to education can become connected to questions of historical inequality. Human interests can conflict with the interests of animals. And once again, we discover something uncomfortable. There is no moral framework that completely eliminates conflict. The language changes, the conflict remains. And that is why moral philosophy matters. It teaches us that moral disagreements are often deeper than I'm right and you're wrong. Sometimes two people are protecting genuinely important values. They simply disagree about which value should have priority. This is especially visible in debates about inequality. A society can formally declare everyone free while people begin life with dramatically different resources. One person is born into wealth. Another is born into poverty. One person has access to excellent schools. Another doesn't. One person inherits property, another inherits debt. One person has social connections, another has none. So we have to ask, is formal freedom enough? Or does justice require us to consider the conditions under which people actually exercise their freedom? That question takes us directly toward virtue ethics and the question of character. Because perhaps morality isn't only about what society owes you, perhaps it's also about who you are becoming. What kind of person are you becoming? This may be one of the most personal questions philosophy can ask. Not, what did you do? But, what are your actions turning you into? This is the heart of virtue ethics. Aristotle's approach shifts our attention away from isolated actions and toward character. A morally good life isn't simply a life in which you obey rules. It is a life in which you develop good qualities. Courage, generosity, honesty, temperance, justice, wisdom. And these qualities aren't developed overnight. They are practiced repeatedly. This is habituation. You become the kind of person who tells the truth by practicing truthfulness. You become disciplined by practicing discipline. You become generous by practicing generosity. You become courageous by repeatedly acting despite fear. And this has enormous implications for everyday life. because every small decision is teaching you something. When you repeatedly choose convenience over responsibility, you're building a habit. When you repeatedly blame other people for your mistakes, you're building a habit. When you repeatedly keep promises, even when they become inconvenient, you're building a habit. When you repeatedly stand up for someone who has less power than you, you're building a habit. Your character isn't created in one dramatic moment. It is constructed quietly, day after day, choice after choice. The golden mean. Aristotle's doctrine of the mean gives us another fascinating idea. Virtue often lies between extremes. Cowardice is a deficiency of courage. Foolhardiness is an excess. Courage exists between them. Miserliness is one extreme. Extravagance is another. Liberality exists between them. But the lesson is not always choose the middle. That would be too simple. The deeper point is that virtue requires judgment. Sometimes courage means speaking. Sometimes courage means remaining silent. Sometimes generosity means giving. Sometimes generosity means refusing to give because giving would encourage dependence or harm. Sometimes honesty means telling the truth. Sometimes honesty requires knowing how to tell the truth without deliberately humiliating someone. This is why virtue ethics are difficult. It doesn't give you a simple instruction manual. It asks you to develop judgment. And developing judgment takes time. It requires experience, failure, reflection, humility, and practice. The morality of habits. Think about your own life for a moment. Not your biggest achievement, not your worst mistake. Think about your ordinary habits. How do you behave when you're tired? How do you behave when you're angry? How do you treat someone who can't help you? How do you behave when nobody important is watching? How do you respond when someone criticizes you? What happens when you get more money? What happens when you lose money? What happens when someone else succeeds? Do you celebrate them? Do you become jealous? Do you pretend not to care? These moments reveal character because character is easiest to see when your preferred image of yourself is under pressure. Anyone can claim to be patient. The question is, what happens when someone tests your patience? Anyone can claim to be honest. The question is, what happens when honesty costs you something? Anyone can claim to be courageous. The question is, what happens when courage becomes dangerous? This is why virtue ethics feel so personal. It doesn't let you hide behind rules. It asks you to look at yourself. Beyond Aristotle. The idea that morality involves character is not uniquely Western. Confucian traditions place enormous importance on cultivating moral character and maintaining harmonious relationships. Buddhist ethical traditions also emphasize transformation of the person, compassion, and the consequences of attachment and self-centeredness. Both traditions challenge the idea that morality is simply about isolated individuals maximizing their own interests. Instead, they emphasize interconnectedness. Your behavior affects others. Their behavior affects you. Your character affects your community, and your community affects your character. This creates a very different picture of morality. You aren't simply asking, what am I allowed to do? You're asking, what kind of human being am I becoming? And what kind of world does that create around me? That question is powerful. But there is another philosopher who would take this challenge to conventional morality much further. Friedrich Nietzsche. Don't become the person the crowd wants. Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of inherited morality. He questioned traditional values and criticized what he saw as forms of herd morality. His concern was that people might accept values simply because everyone around them accepts them. And this is surprisingly relevant in the modern world. Think about how easily we absorb other people's definitions of success. You're supposed to make money. You're supposed to have a certain career. You're supposed to look successful. You're supposed to own certain things. You're supposed to have a particular kind of relationship. You're supposed to behave a certain way. You're supposed to want what everyone else wants. But what happens when you never stop to ask whether those desires are actually yours? You can spend 20 years climbing a ladder only to discover that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. Nietzsche's philosophy forces us to confront the possibility that morality and identity can become forms of conformity. But there is an important warning. Being different does not automatically make you better. Rejecting society doesn't automatically make you free. Strength doesn't automatically make someone virtuous. And individualism without responsibility can become selfishness. This is where Nietzsche's challenge needs to be balanced against another moral insight. We don't become alone. Other people matter. Relationships matter. Care matters. And that brings us to the fourth framework, the morality of care. There is a side of morality that abstract theories can sometimes struggle to capture. It is the side of morality that exists in ordinary human relationships. A parent staying awake with a sick child. A friend answered the phone at 2 a.m. Someone caring for an aging relative. A person helping a stranger who has fallen. A teacher noticing that a student is struggling. A neighbor checking on someone who has disappeared from their normal routine. These acts may not look like grand philosophical decisions, but they are moral acts, and they are often motivated by something deeper than rule. Care ethics emerged in part through feminist philosophical work, including the influential work associated with Carol Gilligan. The central insight is that moral reasoning cannot be reduced entirely to abstract principles of justice. Relationships matter. Context matters. Vulnerability matters. Human dependence matters. And this challenges a very powerful image of human beings, the completely independent individual. We like to think of ourselves as independent, but nobody is independent all the time. You depended on someone when you were young. You may depend on others when you're sick. You may depend on others when you're old. You may depend on friends during emotional crises. You may depend on strangers during emergencies, and other people may depend on you. So perhaps dependence isn't an exception to human life. Perhaps it is part of human life. Why empathy matters. Care ethics asks us to take something seriously that abstract moral systems can sometimes underemphasize. How does this situation feel to the people actually living through it? That's not the same as saying feelings always determine what is right. They don't. But ignoring feelings completely can also be dangerous. You can design a perfectly rational policy that produces terrible human experiences. You can enforce a rule fairly and still create unnecessary suffering. You can win an argument and destroy a relationship. You can be technically correct and morally insensitive. This is where empathy becomes important. Empathy allows us to see another person as more than a category, not the employee, the criminal, the poor person, the rich person, the stranger, the customer, the opponent, but a human being, someone with fears, someone with hopes, someone with a history, someone whose life is more complicated than the role they currently occupy. Care ethics asks us not to lose sight of that. But care has its own danger. Yet care cannot solve everything, because caring about someone can make us biased. You may care deeply about your family, but should family loyalty allow you to excuse wrongdoing? You may care deeply about your friend, but should friendship mean protecting them from every consequence? You may care about your community. But should caring for your community justify harming outsiders? Care without justice can become favoritism. Compassion without boundaries can become destructive. Love can sometimes make us blind. And therefore, care also needs another moral concept: justice. This is why philosophers such as Virginia Held have emphasized that care and justice do not necessarily need to be enemies. A society needs justice, but justice without care can become cold. A society needs rules, but rules without compassion can become cruel. A society needs rights, but rights without responsibility can become selfish. A society needs individuals, but individuals without relationships become isolated. Maybe the real challenge is not choosing one moral theory. Maybe it is learning what each theory can teach us and where each one can fail us. 4 questions for every moral decision. Let's bring everything together. When you're facing a difficult decision, ask yourself 4 questions. First, what is my duty? What principle should I respect, even if doing so is inconvenient? What promise have I made? What responsibility do I have? What rule should I refuse to violate simply because it benefits me? That is the voice of deontology. Then ask, second, whose rights are involved? Who could be harmed? Whose freedom is at stake? What does each person have a legitimate claim to? That is the voice of rights-based ethics. Then ask, third, what kind of person will this decision make me? Will this choice strengthen honesty, courage, justice, generosity, wisdom? Or will it strengthen selfishness, cowardice, dishonesty, resentment? That is the voice of virtue ethics. And finally ask, fourth, who is vulnerable here? Who needs care? What relationships are involved? What would compassion require? What human reality might I be overlooking because I'm too focused on the abstract argument? That is the voice of care ethics. 4 questions, 4 perspectives. And suddenly morality becomes richer. The problem with choosing only one? Imagine living entirely according to duty. You might become principled, reliable, consistent, but perhaps too rigid. Imagine living entirely according to rights. You might become fiercely protective of freedom, but perhaps you could overlook social responsibility. Imagine living entirely according to virtue. You might develop admirable character, but perhaps you could struggle to decide what to do in a specific crisis. Imagine living entirely according to care. You might become compassionate and deeply connected to others, but perhaps your compassion could become partiality. Every framework sees something the others can miss. That's why philosophy isn't simply a competition between theories, it's a conversation. Each theory points a flashlight at one part of the moral landscape. Duty illuminates principles. Rights illuminate freedom. Virtue illuminates character. Care illuminates relationships. And the danger comes when we mistake one flashlight for the entire sun. The moral life is not clean. One reason people become frustrated with philosophy is that they expect philosophy to remove uncertainty. But perhaps that's not what philosophy is supposed to do. Maybe philosophy teaches us how to live responsibly with uncertainty. Because real moral decisions rarely come with a flashing sign saying, "This is the correct answer." Sometimes you make the best decision you can. You explain your reasoning. You accept responsibility, and later you discover that you were wrong. That doesn't necessarily mean thinking was useless. It means morality is difficult, and perhaps humility is therefore part of moral maturity. A morally mature person isn't someone who believes they are always right. It's someone who is willing to examine why they believe they are right. That's different, very different. What do you owe other people? let's return to the question that opened this episode. What do you actually owe other people? Do you owe them honesty? Probably. But are there circumstances where honesty can cause unnecessary harm? Do you owe them freedom? Yes, but does freedom include the freedom to harm others without consequence? Do you owe them justice? But can justice exist without compassion? Do you owe them care? Perhaps. But can caring about everyone equally ever be completely possible? These questions don't have simple answers, and that's exactly why they're worth asking. Because every society eventually has to answer them. Every family answers them. Every workplace answers them. Every friendship answers them. And eventually every individual answers them through the choices they make. The morality of ordinary life. You don't need to be a philosopher to practice philosophy. You practice it when you decide whether to return money someone accidentally gave you. You practice it when you decide whether to admit you made a mistake. You practice it when you decide whether to help someone who cannot help you in return. You practice it when you decide whether to forgive. You practice it when you decide whether to speak when someone else is being mistreated. You practice it when you decide whether to remain silent because speaking would be uncomfortable. You practice it when you decide whether your ambition justifies stepping on someone else. You practice it when you decide whether winning an argument is more important than preserving a relationship. These moments don't feel like philosophy, but they are. And here's something worth remembering. Your moral character is being formed in ordinary moments, not just dramatic ones. The way you treat a waiter, the way you speak to someone who can't benefit you, the way you react when you're wrong, the way you behave when you have power, the way you behave when you have none, the way you treat someone who disagrees with you, the way you treat someone who has nothing to offer you. These moments reveal something. Because morality isn't just about what you say you believe. It's about what your behavior repeatedly demonstrates that you believe. The person you are becoming. This may be the most important lesson of virtue ethics. Every choice is doing two things. It is affecting the world around you, and it is shaping you. When you lie, something happens outside of you, but something also happens inside you. When you keep a promise, something happens outside of you, and something happens inside you. When you practice generosity, courage, patience, or honesty, you are not simply completing isolated actions. You are practicing an identity. Over time, those practices become habits. Habits become character. Character influences decisions, and decisions shape a life. So maybe the question isn't only, was that decision right? Maybe it is also, who am I becoming because I keep making decisions like this? That question can change the way you live. When your values collide, eventually every serious person encounters a moment when their values collide. You want to be honest, but you also want to be kind. You want to protect your family, but you also want to be fair. You want freedom, but you also want security. You want success, but you don't want to become selfish. You want to forgive me, but you also want justice. You want to care for others, but you also need to care for yourself. These conflicts are not signs that morality has failed. They're signs that you're dealing with something genuinely human. The question becomes, can you think carefully enough to recognize what is at stake? Can you resist the temptation to simplify everything? Can you admit that the person who disagrees with you might be protecting a value you have overlooked? Can you change your mind when the evidence changes? Can you act according to principle without becoming rigid? Can you care without becoming blind? Can you defend freedom without ignoring responsibility? Can you pursue success without losing your character? Those are not merely philosophical questions. They are life questions, the moral compass. Perhaps the goal isn't to choose between Kant, Locke, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Gilligan, or any single philosophical tradition. Perhaps the goal is to develop a moral compass capable of listening to several voices. Duty reminds you, not everything is acceptable simply because it benefits you. Rights remind you, other human beings are not yours to control. Virtue reminds you, your choices are shaping the person you become. Care reminds you, other people are not abstract objects. They are human beings connected to you, and together they produce a more complicated, but perhaps more realistic picture of morality. Morality is about principles. Morality is about freedom. Morality is about character. Morality is about relationships. And sometimes those things collide. When they do, you cannot escape responsibility by saying, that's just my philosophy. You still have to choose, and you still have to live with the choice. Final reflection. So, the next time you face a difficult decision, don't immediately ask what's easiest. Don't even ask only what's best for me. Stop and ask 4 questions. What is my duty? Whose rights are involved? What kind of person am I becoming? Who needs care? You may still be uncertain. That's okay. Moral maturity doesn't mean having an answer to every question. Sometimes it means being willing to sit with the question long enough to understand its complexity. Because the opposite of moral maturity isn't simply evil. Sometimes it's thoughtlessness. It's acting without examining your reasons. It's following the crowd because following the crowd is comfortable. It's using your principles only when they benefit you. It's demanding rights while ignoring responsibilities. It's asking for compassion while refusing to show it. It's expecting honesty from everyone else while making excuses for yourself. And perhaps the deepest danger isn't that we will choose the wrong philosophy. It's that we will stop questioning ourselves altogether. The question is yours, so where does that leave us? With duty, with rights, with virtue, with care, perhaps with all 4. And because human beings are too complicated to fit neatly into one moral formula. You're an individual with rights. You're a person with responsibilities. You're a character in development. And you are part of a network of relationships. You need freedom, but you also need responsibility. You need justice, but you also need compassion. You need principles, but you also need wisdom. You need independence, but you also need other people. And maybe that is the real lesson. Morality isn't about becoming perfectly consistent. It is about becoming more conscious of what your choices mean, more conscious of the people affected by your decisions, more conscious of the principles you claim to believe, more conscious of the habits you are building, more conscious of the person you are becoming. Because whether you realize it or not, you are answering these philosophical questions every day. Not with essays, not with theories, not with academic arguments, but with your behavior, with your time, with your money, with your relationships, with your silence, with your courage, with your choices. And eventually, those choices become your life. So here's the question I want you to take with you. When your values collide, what do you choose and why? Not what sounds good, not what you would tell other people, not what makes you look moral. What do you actually choose when there's something real at stake? Tell me in the comments. And don't just give me your answer. Give me your reasoning. Because the most interesting philosophical conversations don't begin when someone says, I'm right. They begin when someone says, here's why I believe this, and I'm willing to question it. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe for more explorations into philosophy, morality, psychology, human behavior, freedom, power, and the ideas that quietly shape our lives. And the next time you make a difficult decision, remember, your actions don't just reveal who you are. They help create who you become. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and never stop questioning the world, your beliefs, and most importantly, yourself. So, if you enjoy conversations that challenge your beliefs, make you see everyday life differently, and leave you thinking long after the video ends, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next conversation.